Hello and welcome to Learn with Jabe. I'm Jabe Jabelson, and this week we are going to learn how to get NBA data using the unofficial official NBA API. In today's video, we will create a data frame with common player info, create a data frame with team info, create a data frame with player career stats, get the play-by-play data for a given game, and get the box score data for a given game. We can turn all of these into functions so we can loop over it for an entire season. And in a future video, I plan to have some fun with these by adding them to a database and firing up some SQL. So, without further ado, bon appetit! Okay, we are going to be doing things in a Jupyter notebook, and before you get started, you need to make sure you have these three packages: NBA API, Pandas, and requests. Now, we will primarily be using the NBA API stats endpoints to get our data. And to start off, we're going to use the basic NBA stats static endpoints to get familiar with some of the player and team data. What's great about this example is the submodules have a class for each of the endpoints that are supported by stats.nba.com. And we'll focus on some of the more well-known ones like traditional stats, box scores, and play-by-play data. Now, the great part is each endpoint supports several methods for accessing the data. So we can get a dictionary, a JSON, and data frames. And we will be using the get data frames method for all of these, which makes it super easy since it returns a list of Pandas Dataframes. And for more about Pandas Dataframes, you can check out some of my other videos, which I'll link to in the notes. Once you have those installed, one more piece of housekeeping, these headers. Now, NBA.com is going to return all of the data in JSON format, and the NBA API packages the JSON data up nicely in a data frame. But to make this work, we have to use some custom headers in advance so we don't hit a brick wall when making requests. So big shout out to Ryan Davis, who basically found this custom header that if we pass in, it's a workaround, and we found a way to make it work to where you're not going to get any timeouts or any issues there unless you're making thousands of calls, in which case you probably need to add in a sleeper in between some of those, so it might take some time. But this is something that, again, I'll link in the notes, and you just want to make sure you include for the calls where we add a header. To start, we're going to get the common player info, which you might see right here. It has some stats, the height, the age, the weight, the birthday, the country, the draft pick, the last attended, and the experience. So these are just some of the basic common player info, which we will try and get, and we'll use Bam out of bio as our example here. So to start, we're going to use that static players. And really what it's going to do is get this player info, which is going to come back in this dictionary like where we have the player ID. We're going to get the full name, the first name, the last name, and then have this is active, true or false. So this is how the data is going to come back when we use our get player method. So to start, let's import our packages. Again, Pandas as PD is the big one. We're importing from this NBA stats static, this players. And then from the endpoints, we're going to get the common player info, which we'll use shortly. And what we're going to do here is really call this players, get players method. And we're going to save that into this list of all NBA players. We'll convert that list into a Pandas data frame. And then we'll call just a sample giving us 5 random rows to give you a look to give you a view of what it looks like. So if we run this, you'll see exactly how we were getting this player info and all of this dictionary. We have this here. We just converted it into a data frame where we have the player ID, the full name, first name, last name is active. And you'll see it's passing in some of this false and true. So we have some older ones. Let's run another sample, see if we get some other random folks. Can't say I know who Forrest McKenzie is. Probably had a short career, I would guess. So now we have a list of all the player IDs in this data frame. And what we can do next is we can basically filter the data frame to only return active players. Well, we'll set this is active equal to true. And then from there, we're going to want to convert it to a list so we can loop over it later on. So what we can do here is we're basically filtering down where the isActive is true, we're only going to take the player ID column because this is what we'll use as a parameter for some of our API endpoint calls later. We are going to convert it to a list, and then we'll save it as this active player IDs, and we can just print that. So it runs, and you'll see here, now we have a list of all of our active player IDs, a pretty long list you can see there. Now that was to just show you how it works, but the NBA API actually makes a call that will get all the active players. So it makes this a little bit easier. And again, we're just calling that players, get active players. We'll save it into this active players list. We'll run that, and then we will loop over this. So let's just say for person in active players, let's just print the person so we can get a look there. Right, and so you see it, we kind of have that same format we had seen before. The player ID, the full name, the first name, the last name, and isActive in this dictionary. And there we have BAM out of bio, who we'll be using as our guinea pig for a lot of these functions and calls. So let's actually start. We'll take BAM's player ID, and let's just save it to a variable, NBA player ID. And so what we're going to use now is this common player info endpoint. And you'll see the parameters. One thing it can take, which is required, is the player ID, which we just got for BAM. And what we're going to return here is this common player info, which will get all of these columns for the player ID we pass in to the common player info endpoint. So let's jump over into Jupyter Notebook and see what happens when we do that for BAM. So to make that call, we are going to call in that common player info, which again we imported earlier. Let's go back up to take a look. We imported this earlier here, so now we could use it. And we're going to call this common player info endpoint, and we're passing in the required argument of player ID, which we're setting equal to this NBA player ID, which again we know is BAM. This is the headers, which we're setting equal to those custom headers we had added before. And let's add a timeout just in case. So this is all of this we're going to save into this player info. And then from there, we can use the get data frame to actually get the data frame on the player info, right? So we know we have this function. Let's actually go back and take a look here. We know we can call this common player info itself, which is what we'll reference. So we're calling this common player info on the player info, and we're saying get data frame and saving that into a data frame. And then let's go ahead and print that. And it's running. Great. And now we get all this common player info for BAM, which again is really just showing a lot of this information from this page in more of a data frame format so we can do a little bit more with it. And what we're going to do next is we're actually going to convert this into a function of the get player data that's going to take in this NBA player ID. We're going to use that player info call, and we're going to save it to a data frame and return it. So this is just creating a function of what we did, where we can actually give it our own input, and in a for loop where, again, we had those player IDs earlier, it will generate and spit back out a data frame. So let's just save that. And for testing purposes, we are just going to use a sample list of player IDs, not all of the active players, because that might take a little while, into this list. So again, this is a list of the player IDs. And now that we have that list, we can make a for loop of 4 NBA player ID in our sample player IDs. And again, we could have that active player ID list later on. We'll print it to know where we are. We're going to run this player info. That's that new function we created, get player data. That again takes in that NBA player ID. And we're going to append that to this empty player data list. And finally, at the end, we're going to concatenate with pandas all of the player data to create this final data frame, which we will then print out. So let's run this for loop for each of these sample player IDs. And then we could take another sample of our final data frame, and let's just take 20 rows. Aha, and there we have it. So we have the common player info for a whole host of all those sample player IDs. We got Grayson Allen, Al Farouk Amino, Jared Allen, Ryan Anderson, OG Anunoby, and we got Giannis's brother, Thanasis, Trevor Ariza, and there's Bam out of bio, again, with all that same information, but now in a bigger data frame with all the common player info. Awesome start. Let's move on to teams next. All right, the next thing we're going to do is create a data frame with teams and team info. So this is going to be very similar to the player. However, we're going to be importing teams from the NBA API. And this time for the teams, we're going to get a similar dictionary, except it's going to have the team ID, the full name, the abbreviation, the nickname, the city, state, and year founded. So it will behave very similar to the players, but we will be doing the teams. So here we need to import our teams from the NBA API, and then we're basically just making this call to get teams. We'll save it into this list of NBA teams, and then we'll convert that to a data frame and print it. And again, this should be pretty straightforward. So we print it here. Aha! We have all of the NBA teams in alphabetical order, starting from the Atlanta Hawks, I guess not in alphabetical order, all the way down to the Charlotte Hornets. We get the three-letter abbreviation, the nickname, the city and the state, and the year founded. So what will be important here is this team ID, which again we can use later on. So the next one is getting the player career stats, and we'll create a data frame. And here we are calling our first endpoint this player career stats. And if we go to the documentation, which has all of the endpoint documentation, let's go all the way down, LMNOP, player career stats. We'll see here what's required is the per mode and the player ID. I believe we will have these by default, and really we're just calling this player career stats endpoint. We will have all of these available to us. I guess we want to get the career totals regular season will likely be what we're after. So let's come over here. Let's import it. And if we run this for Bam Adebayo, we pass in his player ID to the player career stats. And we're going to get that first data frame, which should be his career regular season data. Here we have his 4 seasons in the league up till the current one. And we get all of his information as well as his totals. This looks like his regular season totals, which we now have in a data frame called career. I guess we could also save this to a data frame. df equals, then let's just print the df. Very similar. Now it's in a data frame. Should look nearly identical. And there you have it. Moving right along, we are going to get the play-by-play data for a given game. And for this one, we'll first start by getting a list of game IDs. And to do that, we are going to use the League Game Finder endpoint, which will run here. And this one is where we're going to get game logs from the regular season. And we're going to pass in a few parameters here. One, we're going to pass in this most recent NBA season with the season nullable, set it equal to 2020-21. We want to make sure this is for the NBA with the proper league ID. And then we want to get the regular season. So we're not going to include the playoffs, the championships, the play-in games, summer league, any of the other types. And then what we are going to do is save this into a games, save it as a data frame, and then let's get the head showing the first 5 of that games. So when we run that, we'll see here we have this most recent season. Looks like we have the Warriors, the Jazz, the Suns, the Wizards, and the Timberwolves. You'll see some of these matchups, which are the game IDs, and a lot of information about the given games. Great. So what we want to do next is basically, let's get a list of the distinct game IDs. And we can do that by saying, let's say game ID, set it equal to, we want to access this game ID within this game's data frame. So that is game ID will give us the column. And we basically want this method to get all of the unique game IDs. And we want to save it to a list. And so when we run this, and if we were to look at these game IDs, we should have a list of all the unique game IDs from the 2021 season. Fantastic. And so with the game ID, we can fetch the play-by-play data for that game. So let's take a random one right here, and we'll set that game ID equal to what we have there. I don't know which game we're going to see here, but we'll find out soon enough. And then what we're going to do is use this play-by-play endpoint from the NBA stats endpoint. You know the drill. We're going to pass in the game ID, get that play-by-play v2 endpoint, save it into this PBP, short for play-by-play. We'll get the data frame, and then we'll print it, and we should get the first 5 rows of action from that game, which is... All right, so it looks like it was the Timberwolves. I can't see who else. Let's print a little bit more below. Let's actually look at the tail. Let's see how this thing ended. Let's see the last 10 actions. Okay, the end of the 4th. McConnell, offensive rebound. Holiday, that looks like this is a Pacers versus Timberwolves game. You see here a missed Russell 26-foot 3-point jump shot. Yeah, we got Indiana, we have Minnesota. So this is the Pacers versus the Timberwolves, and what was likely a barn burner. I don't know if we have the score anywhere. No, doesn't look like it. So here we have, again, the play-by-play data for a given game. Awesome. One more to go. All right, next up is getting the box score data for a given game. Now, I envision in the future we might be able to take box score data and run some SQL queries to try and see what were certain players' stats. That will be a good way to learn SQL. So what we're going to do here is, again, calling that endpoint, we're going with our box score traditional v2. And we're going to import that. And let's head over to the documentation to see what we can find. All right, to box score, and we just care about the traditional stats. Box score traditional v2. Here we have the documentation. And again, it's just taken in a game ID, and it has all of these defaults. And for the most part, we want to get player stats instead of team stats. So if we call that first data frame, it should give us the player stats. So what we can do here is, again, call this box score traditional. We're going to pass in game ID, which should be our same variable we used before. Again, it was a Pacers versus Timberwolves barn burner. And we'll save everything into that player stat data. We'll call that first data frame, which should give us back the player stats. We'll look at another way just to get the player stats versus team stats in general. Save that into a stats data frame, and then look at the first 5 rows. So if we run this, we see that Karl Anthony Towns was a +9. You got to think maybe the T-Wolves won that game. Let's also look at the tail instead. And the Pacers, you had Jeremy Lamb +14. So actually I don't know who won. Let's see if it has the outcome. Maybe not. All right, so next let's turn this into a function. And what we're going to do is we're basically going to create this get box score data, which will return the data frame that we want, like here. It's going to need a game ID that will be input. We'll set that parameter equal to the game ID one that's required. Again, we're passing in our custom headers and this timeout parameter just in case to make sure we don't get jammed up. We're saving it to this player stat data, and then what we're doing differently here is we're actually calling the player stats and getting the data frame here versus before we just were taking the first data frame provided back. And again, if we go back and look at this, we see that there's the player stats and the team stats. So we theoretically could also change this to be team stats, and that would pass us back the team stats for the box score, but we are interested in the player, so we'll keep that there. And we'll go ahead and set up that function. And then what we're going to do is take just a slice, get some sample game IDs because we don't want to loop over the entire season. That could take a while. Run that. And then lastly, we're going to create, similar to like we did before, an empty box scores list. And we're basically saying for game ID and sample game IDs. Again, you can put that actual game IDs when you're ready. We want to get the box score data, which takes in our get box score data function, the game ID, which we're looping over, appends it to the box scores, and then we're going to convert that box scores into a data frame at the end. So this will give us the box scores for these 4 game IDs. If we run that, and then let's just sample this with 10 rows. And it looks like we have some Chicago, Oklahoma City, Golden State. You'll see we took a couple of those different game IDs, and we're just taking random rows. And now we have box score data at the player level, which again, we can take this and kind of create a a database later on that hopefully we can run some SQL queries on. All right, and if you've made it this far, we're going to give you a very special bonus of how to get all the 2020-21 play-by-play data using the GameID. We're going to breeze through this, mostly copy-pasteing, and I'll give you a little bit of blurb of what we're doing without this. Again, all of my code will be linked in the description. You can check out my GitHub, and as a reminder, if you're enjoying this, smash that subscribe button. But what we're going to do differently here is use this requests structure and pass in the URL with the GameID. And in that response, we'll get the play-by-play, we'll get the game, and we'll take those actions. We'll save that into a data frame, append the GameID as a new column, and then return the data frame. So let's run this. And again, our sample GameIDs, which I just pulled randomly, we'll use these four. And very similar to above, we're just running this getData function that we created. We're looping it over, saving it in play-by-play, and saving that out to a final data frame. And again, we're doing a little bit different here. I'll explain it more in the blog post. We also can run this by using all of the NBA API, but I wanted to give you a different flavor if I'm making it this far. So if we run that, and then let's actually print that in its entirety. And here we have the play-by-play data for all of those 4 games, which again is already 2,200 rows and 55 columns. A lot of non-values, but we should be able to make some magic with this. And there you have it, a walkthrough of some fun ways we can use the unofficial official NBA API. Again, I will link to that GitHub repo in the notes. A very special thank you to everyone who keeps that up to date, because man, it is powerful and you can do a lot. And this is only the first series. I believe we're going to be jumping into a lot more of NBA data and try and mix in a little SQL coming up. But step 1 is getting all of this data into dataframes so we can move it over to a nice database for us to query later on. So I'm Jade Jabelson. This was Learn with Jade. Smash that subscribe button when you get a shot. Until next week, bon voyage.